Welcome to Compact Warfare from compactwarfare.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 60, the Soviet-Afghan War. In the years before Soviet tanks crossed the Afghan border, Afghanistan was already a country in deep turmoil. Far from being a sudden Cold War battleground, it was a state struggling with rapid political change, social tension, and a widening gap between ambitious reformers and a deeply traditional society. By the late 1970s, the pressure was building toward collapse. For much of the 20th century, Afghanistan had been ruled by monarchs who maintained a careful balance between modernization and tradition. That balance was shattered in 1973, when the monarchy was overthrown in a coup led by Mohammed Daoud Khan. His republic promised progress, but delivered instability. Daoud attempted to centralize power, weaken tribal authority, and push secular reforms, alienating religious leaders and rural communities while failing to stabilize the economy. The real rupture came in April 1978, when the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in a violent coup. The new regime immediately launched an aggressive program of reform: land redistribution, expanded rights for women, secular education, and the suppression of religious influence. On paper, these changes looked revolutionary. On the ground, they were disastrous. Afghanistan was overwhelmingly rural, conservative, and deeply religious. Reforms were imposed quickly, often brutally, and with little understanding of local customs. Village elders were sidelined, clerics were imprisoned or executed, and traditional power structures were smashed without being replaced by anything functional. Resistance flared almost immediately, particularly in the countryside, where government authority was weakest. Worse still, the ruling party itself was divided. Rival factions within the PDPA turned on each other, purging opponents and paralyzing decision-making. Leadership changed hands through assassinations and arrests, creating a climate of fear even within the government. Rather than stabilizing the country, the revolution accelerated its descent into chaos. By 1979, armed uprisings had spread across large parts of Afghanistan. The government controlled major cities but struggled to exert authority beyond them. Desertions from the army increased, local militias formed, and the state relied more heavily on repression to survive. The promise of social transformation had curdled into violence and instability. To outside observers, Afghanistan now looked dangerously close to collapse. For the Soviet Union, this was deeply troubling. A friendly government on its southern border was imploding, replaced by unrest that threatened to spill across Central Asia. What followed would be framed as assistance, stabilization, and even necessity. In reality, Afghanistan, before the invasion, was already a warning. The war did not begin with foreign troops. It began with a revolution that moved too fast, listened too little, and tore open fault lines the country could not survive. When the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan in December 1979, it was not acting on impulse. The decision emerged from a growing sense of alarm in Moscow that events on its southern border were slipping beyond control. What had begun as support for a friendly socialist government was rapidly becoming a strategic nightmare, and Soviet leaders feared the consequences of doing nothing almost as much as the risks of intervention. At the center of Soviet concern was the Afghan communist regime itself. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which Moscow had initially welcomed as a regional ally, was collapsing under the weight of its own brutality and incompetence. Successive Afghan leaders promised stability while delivering purges, repression, and rebellion. Soviet advisors on the ground sent increasingly grim reports back to the Kremlin, warning that the government in Kabul might not survive without direct military support. Cold War paranoia amplified these fears. Afghanistan sat uncomfortably close to the Soviet Union's Central Asian republics, regions with their own Muslim populations and histories of unrest. A hostile or unstable Afghanistan raised the specter of ideological contagion, insurgency, or Western influence creeping toward Soviet borders. Soviet policymakers worried that the United States, China, or regional powers might exploit the chaos to undermine Soviet security in Central Asia. There was also a question of credibility. The Soviet Union had built its image as the patron of socialist movements worldwide. Allowing a Marxist government to fall so publicly, especially one that had explicitly aligned itself with Moscow, risked signaling weakness to both allies and rivals. Intervention, in this sense, was as much about reputation as territory. The Kremlin feared that inaction would invite challenges elsewhere in the socialist world. Internal Afghan politics pushed Moscow closer to action. The rise of Hafizullah Amin, whose erratic behavior and violent purges alarmed Soviet leaders, convinced many in the Politburo that Afghanistan was not merely unstable but dangerous. Amin was increasingly viewed as unpredictable, possibly even disloyal, and incapable of defeating the growing insurgency. Replacing him with a more compliant figure appeared, to Soviet planners, a manageable solution. What the Soviet leadership underestimated was the complexity of the problem. They assumed a limited intervention would stabilize Kabul, secure the regime, and allow a quick withdrawal. The Red Army was expected to act as a temporary force, not a long-term occupier. Afghanistan, in Soviet thinking, would be fixed, not fought over. This miscalculation lay at the heart of Moscow's decision. The intervention was born from fear, ideology, and overconfidence, a combination that would soon drag the Soviet Union into a war it neither fully understood nor knew how to end. When Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan in late December 1979, the operation was framed in Moscow as limited, controlled, and temporary. The Red Army was not expected to fight a major war. Its mission, as defined by Soviet planners, was to stabilize the Afghan government, secure key cities, and suppress what was assumed to be a manageable insurgency. The reality on the ground would dismantle these assumptions with remarkable speed. The invasion began with precision and confidence. Elite Soviet units seized Kabul, assassinated Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin, and installed a more pliable successor. Airports, government buildings, and military bases were secured in a matter of days. To Soviet commanders, this swift success appeared to confirm their belief that the operation would be brief. Afghanistan, it seemed, had been brought under control before it had time to resist. That confidence evaporated almost immediately. Outside major urban centers, the Afghan state barely existed. Soviet troops found themselves responsible for securing vast rural areas connected by poor roads and separated by difficult terrain. Mountains, deserts, and narrow valleys favored defenders who knew the land. Supply lines were stretched thin, convoys were vulnerable to ambush, and helicopters became essential simply to move men and equipment. More troubling was the nature of the resistance. The insurgents were not a single unified force, but a loose network of local fighters motivated by religion, tribal loyalty, and opposition to foreign occupation. These groups avoided direct confrontation, preferring hit-and-run attacks that sapped Soviet morale and resources. The Red Army, trained for conventional warfare in Europe, struggled to adapt to guerrilla tactics that turned every village and mountain pass into a potential battlefield. Soviet soldiers also faced an enemy they had not anticipated: isolation. Many conscripts were young, poorly prepared, and deeply unfamiliar with Afghan culture. Language barriers, harsh living conditions, and constant threat of attack eroded morale. Drug use, indiscipline, and psychological strain became widespread. What was meant to be a stabilizing presence increasingly resembled an occupation force under siege. Efforts to impose control through firepower often made matters worse. Airstrikes and artillery were used to punish suspected rebel areas, but civilian casualties fueled anger and expanded support for the insurgency. Each attempt to crush resistance seemed to create more of it. The war spread rather than contained itself. Within months, the contradiction was clear. The Red Army had entered Afghanistan expecting compliance and order. Instead, it found a country that resisted in fragments, fought without front lines, and refused to be pacified. What began as a limited intervention was already turning into a grinding, open-ended conflict. As Soviet forces settled into Afghanistan, The conflict rapidly transformed into a war the Red Army was ill-equipped to fight. Resistance hardened, spread, and took on a robust ideological frame. What might have remained scattered local uprisings became a sustained guerrilla campaign, increasingly defined as a religious struggle against foreign occupation. This was the rise of the mujahideen. The term mujahideen simply means those who struggle, or strugglers for God, but in practice it came to represent a broad and fragmented resistance movement. Fighters were organized along tribal, regional, and ideological lines rather than under a single command. Some groups were deeply religious, others were motivated more by local grievances or opposition to Kabul's authority. What united them was hostility to the Soviet presence and the Afghan government it supported. Guerrilla warfare suited Afghanistan's terrain perfectly. Small units operated from mountain villages, caves, and remote valleys, striking quickly before disappearing into the landscape. Soviet convoys were ambushed, helicopters shot down, and isolated outposts harassed relentlessly. There were no front lines, no decisive engagements, and no clear enemy headquarters to destroy. The war became a constant drain rather than a contest of decisive victories. Religion gave the resistance moral power as well as recruits. Framing the conflict as jihad turned local resistance into a cause with international appeal. Volunteers arrived from across the Muslim world, bringing money, weapons, and ideological fervor. Training camps sprang up across the Afghan-Pakistani border, where fighters could regroup beyond the reach of Soviet forces. What had begun as a domestic revolt was now part of a broader religious and geopolitical struggle. External support transformed the balance of the war. Pakistan became a critical conduit for weapons and funding, while the United States and its allies saw an opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union without direct confrontation. Sophisticated weapons, most famously shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, neutralized Soviet air superiority and changed battlefield dynamics. Helicopters that once symbolized control now became vulnerable targets. The Soviet response struggled to adapt. Large-scale sweeps through rural areas failed to eliminate fighters who simply melted away. Collective punishments and village clearances hardened local resentment. Each new operation seemed to create more enemies than it destroyed. The war fed on itself, growing more entrenched with every passing year. By the mid-1980s, the conflict had taken on its defining shape. The Soviets held cities and major roads. The mujahideen controlled much of the countryside. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Afghanistan had become a grinding guerrilla war, powered by faith, geography, and global rivalry, with no obvious end in sight. By the mid-1980s, it was increasingly clear that the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan had reached a dead end. Despite years of fighting, tens of thousands of troops, and enormous material investment, the Soviet Union could not achieve a decisive victory. Cities remained under government control, but the countryside was contested or effectively lost. The war had settled into a grinding stalemate, costly, demoralizing, and politically toxic. Militarily, the Red Army adapted but never truly solved the problem it faced. Tactics improved, special forces became more effective, and counterinsurgency operations grew more sophisticated. Yet none of this altered the core reality. The mujahideen did not need to win battles, they only needed to survive. Every Soviet offensive cleared territory temporarily, only for resistance fighters to return once troops withdrew. Control was fleeting, fragile, and expensive. At home, the war's impact was becoming impossible to ignore. Soviet casualties mounted steadily, with tens of thousands killed or wounded. Many soldiers returned physically injured or psychologically scarred, while others never came back at all. Coffins arrived quietly in provincial towns, often accompanied by vague explanations and official silence. Public trust eroded as rumors spread, and the gap between propaganda and reality widened. Economically, the conflict drained a system already under strain. Supplying a distant war in harsh terrain required massive logistical effort, diverting resources from a stagnating domestic economy. The cost of weapons, fuel, transport, and reconstruction piled up year after year, with little to show for it. Afghanistan had become a sinkhole for money, men, and morale. The turning point came with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. When he became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, Gorbachev inherited a war he privately regarded as a mistake. He referred to Afghanistan as a bleeding wound, a conflict that undermined his broader goals of reform and openness. Unlike his predecessors, he was willing to admit that the war could not be won by military means. Diplomatic efforts accelerated. Talks involving Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Soviet Union, and the United States led to agreements that provided Moscow with a face-saving exit, characterized in the Geneva Accords. In 1988, the Soviets announced their intention to withdraw. The process was staged and cautious, designed to avoid the appearance of defeat, but the reality was unmistakable. The final Soviet troops crossed back over the border in February 1989. The withdrawal ended a decade of fighting without victory, resolution, or stability. Afghanistan was left shattered, and the Soviet Union departed, knowing it had fought a war it could not control, could not justify, and ultimately could not sustain. When the last Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan in February 1989, the war did not truly end. It simply moved into a new and far more unstable phase, leaving consequences that would stretch far beyond Afghanistan's borders. For the Soviet Union, the conflict had become a symbol of overreach, miscalculation, and decline. Inside Afghanistan, the withdrawal created a power vacuum rather than peace. The Soviet-backed government in Kabul survived for a few more years, propped up by aid and military supplies, but without Soviet troops, its position was untenable. When it finally collapsed in 1992, rival mujahideen factions turned on one another. The unity forged during resistance dissolved into civil war, devastating cities and civilian life. Out of this chaos would eventually emerge the Taliban, a movement shaped by war, ideology, and exhaustion. For the Soviet Union, the war's legacy was corrosive. Afghanistan exposed the limits of Soviet military power and shattered the myth of ideological certainty. Veterans returned disillusioned, carrying stories that contradicted decades of official propaganda. The conflict fed public skepticism and contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in the state. While Afghanistan did not single-handedly cause the Soviet collapse, it accelerated pressures already building within the system. Internationally, the war reshaped global dynamics. The United States and its allies had successfully weakened their Cold War rival without direct confrontation, reinforcing a model of proxy warfare that would be repeated elsewhere. Weapons, fighters, and militant networks forged during the conflict did not disappear when the Soviets left. They spread, influencing conflicts from the Middle East to South Asia. Afghanistan itself paid the heaviest price. Millions were displaced, infrastructure lay in ruins, and an entire generation grew up knowing little beyond conflict. The social and economic damage inflicted during the war set back development for decades. Efforts at reconstruction were repeatedly undermined by ongoing violence and political fragmentation. In hindsight, the Soviet-Afghan War stands as a cautionary tale. A superpower entered a complex society, believing it could impose stability through force and ideology. Instead, it triggered a chain of events it could neither predict nor control. The war weakened a global power, destabilized a region, and helped create the conditions for future conflicts that continue to shape world politics today. Afghanistan did not defeat the Soviet Union on the battlefield, but it exposed the fragility of a system that could not survive the cost of its own ambitions. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Warfare, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactwarfare.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, mysteries, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/warfarecoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.